Hello and welcome to the Aural Apothecary Podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Pod guests share their career-defining drug, song and book and also share their joyful patient stories.
Welcome to the Aural Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. For this episode, we're joined by Dr. Matthew Jones and Angela Carrinton. Matthew is a senior lecturer in medicine safety, medicines information and pharmaceutics at the University of Bath. Angela, already in the Aural Apothecary alumni, having joined us for a great episode from Series 1, is the lead pharmacist for medication safety for Northern Ireland. We'll hear from Matthew and Angela in a moment. Matthew might get to share a drug for our formulary, his career anthem, and recommends a book for the Aural Apothecary Library. The focus of this episode will be on when guidelines go wrong. But first, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff.
Evening all. So today we had our latest, it's a launch of a piece of safety work around falls and pressure damage, building on the stuff we've done previously. Jamie let me down. He couldn't attend because he was otherwise busy. And so we literally rang the fire brigade.
Fireman Sam?
We're the fire brigade. It was the South Wales Fire Service talking about teamwork. So that was good fun. But I'm only joking. We're looking forward to having you at the next session, Jamie, hopefully.
Very good. You mentioned Fireman Sam, Steve. I was in Tonopandi yesterday doing a session to Age Cymru. And so
it's not just thrown together.
It's Pontypandy.
Indeed. So Pontypandy and naughty Norman Price came straight to my attention. So there we are. What have you been up to, Steve? RPS conference?
Yeah, let's talk about the RPS conference, shall we? So Jamie and I were there. Unfortunately, Gimmo wasn't able to make it. Liz O'Riordan was one of the guest speaker, really. And if you haven't listened to the episode 5.6, it was a stonking episode when she came on, and she absolutely smashed it at the RPS, all about her journey as a patient and asking us all the time, well, how do you know you're providing quality care? And the basically byline is, if you don't listen to the patient and you don't involve them in their care, then you're probably not providing quality care. But we also got stopped, didn't we, Jane? Quite literally, at one point we felt like we had a load of groupies, didn't we? We had lots of people saying very nice things about the podcast. And we always, it's not that we crave feedback, but it's difficult to get feedback. So people actually stopped us, didn't they, Jane? And so I'd like to shout out those who came and made the effort to come and talk to us, who I know are listeners. So Rachel Westwood, Northampton Hospital, Jeff Aston, and a friend of mine, Antonio Ochoa Ferreira, both work at University Hospitals, Birmingham. Sarah Kavanagh, Public Health Pharmacy Advisor, NHS East, and Sinead Peer, who's an ex-clinical fellow at NICE. And they basically were telling us how much they enjoyed it. Yeah, James, similar feedback?
Yeah, great day. Liz was superb. Good use of the word stonking there, Steve, as well. I have to applaud that. That's very good. Haven't heard that for around 20 years. I've got a question, really, for the listener. And I'd like to know this. How many people at the conference on Friday washed their hands with mouthwash? So for our human factor guest tonight, and obviously, and Gimmo, this is a behavioural experiment extraordinaire.
We've got pictures. Jamie and I took it independently.
In the conference venue, which is a very plush, smart conference venue, for some strange reason, all the sinks had mouthwash by the side of them. It looked like soap. I think it smelled like soap. But was labelled mouthwash. And so there were lots of confused pharmacists walking around the place. And with a few had said, I can't believe I've just washed my hands with mouthwash. And you see where the mouthwash was placed and you think, well, that's perfectly reasonable because it's there.
Next to the soap and the lotion that were obviously also in bottles with squeezy tops.
And then there were some people that were blissfully unaware that they'd washed their hands in mouthwash until they realised that people were talking about. And so, yeah, you would have loved it, Kimmo.
And did anyone gargle any hand wash?
No.
They weren't quite look-alike.
That's what I was going to say. Is it a Lhasa era? Because the pharmacists would be loving that.
Yeah. No, to be fair, it was bright blue and smelt a mint, but,
Yeah.
But to be fair, if the shape, the outline, the shape, and then the fact it's beside the sink and our behavioural, approach, that's what we're going to expect as soap. That's what people are going to press on. So, yeah.
You couldn't make it up.
No respecter of status either, Angela. Okay, no respect or status for the people that were washing their hands with mouthwash.
Oh, I've just remembered one other thing that somebody said about the Aural Apothecary, and this is true. We should get more people on from secondary care, and we should get more specialists on. And I agree with that. And as my friend Antonio said, he's a super specialist, works in inherited metabolic diseases, but he really, goes to town on shared decision-making and person-centered care. So I think we should take that. And the other feedback was from a friend of mine called Brian Smith, who, when I was explaining to somebody unbeknown about the Aural Apothecary podcast, Brian looked at him and he looked at me and he said, "I know it sounds shit," he said, "but actually it's really good."
There we go. We'll put that on the show notes.
I'm going to put one thing out there as well. Look, I started my CPD 2025 file today.
Is that because you got called because you didn't do the one by the 30th of October?
I attended a coaching for neurodiverse employees today, and it was brilliant. And so it's gone straight in as a first entry for that 2025 journey. Let's move on. Our great pleasure. You've heard from her already, look. But let's welcome to the podcast Dr. Matthew Jones and Angela Carrinton. A return for Angela. Welcome both.
Hello, thank you very much.
Angela, nice to have you back on.
Yeah, delighted to be back. Yeah, it's enjoying the banter as usual.
Very good. And for you, Matthew, a new experience catching up on the Aural Apothecary.
Absolutely. And I should put my hand up. I did nearly wash my hands with mouthwash at the RPS conference. Last minutely avoided it. So
did you take a photo of the sink and the mouthwash?
I didn't. But then I did suddenly realise that the toilet smelt of mouthwash, which was bizarre, but I hadn't noticed it until that point. So I don't know what that tells us about human psychology, but something.
Oh, I would suspect there's a whole SEEPs analysis you could do on this.
There's a paper in there.
Well, I was disappointed that Steve didn't put it on social media and ask the question, really, because he took the photo.
We'll put it on related to this episode.
There we go. Because I think every conference there must have the same. There must be people wandering around. Anyway.
No, it wasn't there last year.
Leave it, guys. Leave it. Move on.
I just want to say one thing to Angela. Look, when you came on first time, Angela, one of your choices was Still Not Safe.
Yeah.
And that's what I do, look, when I read a book.
Wow,
look at that.
You put me to shame because I keep saying to myself, I need to reread it again because I'm not a good one for rereading books, but I definitely think it's a real mind-shifting book, really, and for anybody who's interested in patient safety, which everybody should be. So I promote it to anybody and everybody who I encounter in the world that I mix it with, because I think we need to understand, where we've come from and why we are where we are now, with respect to the patient safety sort of approach to everything. And in some ways, we've taken many wrong directions in it.
So Still Not Safe, Patient Safety and the Middle Managing of American Medicine. Robert Wares and Kathleen Sutcliffe. Gimmo?
When I listened to the episode back, that was my action as well, Jamie, I was going to go and reread it because I thought, I can't remember if I'd read it when you recommended it or read it on your recommendation, but it really debunks a lot of the things that we probably still do, like, the way we analyze errors, the way we focus on improvement, and it, and our last episode with John Seddon was the same as, he was challenging a lot of the conventional ways of doing things. And that's what he does, isn't it?
Yeah, but I do think it's interesting how I think PSURF in England has really radically started to change the mindset of how we look at things from a safety perspective. So it's bringing in actually, and more of that, certainly systems analysis,
and
but
safety
also
too
that
as
sort
well,
of
isn't it?
safety too. That's what I was about to say, which is where we stop really focusing on where things go wrong constantly, because most of the time things go right, and what goes wrong and what goes right occurs in the same system. But it'll take time for that to kind of really seep in. But I definitely am very, very encouraged to see that mindset change happening. Particularly it's coming from national level as well.
I also loved that book and I've recommended it to lots of people. And in fact, again, back at RPS, I was talking to Rahul Singhal, who's the Chief Medicines Information Officer at NHS Digital. And I must have told him about it before because he said to me, "Oh, by the way, I read that book." And he was just saying how brilliant it was. And I suppose my for the listener, my message when I took away from it was, well, we spent 20 years trying to look at patient safety, and we wonder why it doesn't look like we've moved very far. And the basic message was we should have asked the people who are probably able to give us the expert opinion, who are on the outside, rather than thus of us on the inside, like the doctors and the pharmacists. We should have asked the ergonomic people, the engineers and such like. And that was the key message, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. And actually, that's what we, as healthcare needs to start accepting, that we need to actually recruit people who've got specialism in that. yes, I did my human factors diploma in patient safety, and I've done, I've done my quality improvement, in it courses and things like this. But, I've trained as a professional and, in a subject area, and that's what my expertise is. We dabble in these things. And actually, that's where we shouldn't be dabbling. We should be bringing in that bona fide expertise who can look at things in that sort of more impartial setting. But we're starting to see more of that. There are starting to recruit human factor specialists within organisations, but it needs to happen a bit more at pace, really.
Okay, thanks, Angela. Matthew, welcome. Your research interest is where we're going to focus the rest of the podcast on, I think. Can you just share with us what that looks like?
Well, my research is a bit of a mixed bag. So you'd have got that from my ludicrously long job title when you read it out earlier. But it boils down into two areas. The one we're going to talk about tonight, which is kind of medication safety, medicines information, and the links between them. But I actually began my research career doing drug delivery to the lungs and working in a pharmaceutics lab. And I still do things like that as well. So keeps life interesting for me.
Yeah, so we'll push that one to one side for this evening. And let's come back to your medicine safety work, and in particular, look, we said we're going to be exploring when guidelines go wrong. What's an intro into that subject look like?
Well, I think I can take it back actually to probably about 15 years when I was working as a hospital pharmacist, as a medicines information pharmacist actually, and it was the first moment that sort of I started to think about this was when some new antibiotic guidelines were launched in my trust, and we'd been really helpful. We'd added doses for all the antibiotics into them. And then so for vancomycin, we'd said vancomycin 1 gram twice a day. And so, of course, all the patients got vancomycin 1 gram twice a day, even if they were 85 and with very dodgy renal function. So it was just the first moment that made me think, actually, yeah, we're trying to be helpful here, but what you write in these guidelines can cause problems. And that got me thinking, and I've been sort of thinking and playing with those ideas for the last 15 years in different ways, trying to solve that problem and so on. And so this paper was our attempt to, if you look in research that's been done before, you can sort of see hints that people have picked up that poorly designed guidelines can cause problems, but no one's ever specifically looked at it. And so we wanted to give it a really detailed look to see what goes wrong and where and for whom and things like that.
Very good. So I'm with you slightly on this because I picked up, and you've published lots of work with him, it looks like, as well. Theo Rayner's work quite early on around user testing, because it used to drive me wild when, with all the best intentions...
Excitement or anger?
Anger. All the best intentions, we would produce laminated copies of stuff and think, well, that'll solve it, won't it? That'll solve it. And we never user tested. And it's only recently, I think, a lot of the patient materials that we end up producing don't get, have only recently sort of come into that sphere of user testing. So I'm a huge fan of Professor Rayner's work. You've published with him. The one that really comes to mind was his work on the anticoagulation.
Yeah. The
new anticoagulation update. But then you've gone on to, what areas have you worked with him on, Matthew?
Yes. So, we've worked with Theo. Theo's been a really valuable mentor in my career and through all of this journey. It's been a real pleasure working with him. And what we did together was we took his user testing approach, which had been largely applied to patient information, and said, well, okay, so professionals are more trained than patients, but they're still human. They can still make mistakes. So what happens if we take that user testing and we apply it to guidelines for professionals? And that was really my way into this whole field as a sort of active researcher. And so we worked on intravenous administration guidelines for nurses, which is quite a nice case study because they're written by pharmacists and used by nurses. So you've got a professional divide there. And there was a great quote in one of my user testing interviews in that study where the nurse just looked at it and went, "It's written in pharmacist." Instantly know what she means. And so we user tested the guidelines, and then we did this randomized in situ simulation, which sounds very posh, but it was great fun. I took one of those rubber mannequin arms that you can practice your injection technique on, and I took it around 4 hospitals in the area and got nurses in the middle of their shifts. So when they were busy and tired and all of those things that lead to errors, I got them to take 10 minutes to give it a dose of a placebo. And then they were randomized to use our user-tested guidelines or the original version. And the content was exactly the same, but the user-tested ones was presented, hopefully, in a more user-friendly way. And we saw how many mistakes they made. And we saw about a 2.5-fold reduction in the number of errors they made through using the user-tested guidelines. And they could do it faster and they felt more confident about it. So it was a real pleasing result in that situation. So that was my way into it, and the first project where I worked with Theo in this area.
So those conditions, very quickly, are hungry, angry, late and tired. They're the type of conditions that we would put some people under stress, yeah?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's why we tried to do it on the wards with people at work, because I could have hauled them into a lab at the university, but it's just not the same.
I may have said this on the pod before, because we've done 70 episodes, but the All Wales medicines chart went through a number of iterations over the years, and we received an email from a researcher in London, and apparently he tried a number of times to contact us, and in the final he just wrote, "I think your drug chart is killing people." So he got our attention, and he'd used eye tracking software with nurses, and again it turns out that the medicines chart had been designed in pharmacy speak, not administration thoughts. And so, again, it was a fascinating conversation. We invited him down in the end and he ran a symposium for us. But the use of eye tracking software around the medicine chart had been focused so much on prescribers and getting the prescribing right that it was making the nursing job of administration, especially around syringe pumps and IVs, much, much harder.
So just to reiterate to the listener, what did we just say before? The reason why we haven't made as much progress in patient safety is that we weren't paying attention to the external experts. We were just thinking we could fix it all ourselves.
Absolutely. And following that, I'd say we were talking earlier about bringing in human factors expertise. I'd also add bring in design expertise as well. Why? Just because we know the content of our guidelines or what we want on our drug chart, maybe we don't know the best way to design it.
But clip art is still okay, isn't it?
Absolutely. And Comic Sans font and capital letters.
Hang on, we have to give a shout out here to the deceased Professor David Cousins and the fabulous work he did with the Royal it's the design school anyway in London. Do you remember, Angela?
Yeah.
With the stuff really clear about injectables and the labels, and the biggest font should be the milligrams per mil. That was brilliant stuff, wasn't it? And again, there's a really early example of using expertise outside of we know best.
Okay, just picking up on the milligrams per mil, I'll give you an interesting snippet from that user testing study where we found that the nurses didn't relate to milligrams per mil because the thing they held in their hand was 200 milligrams in 10 mils. That's what they knew they were handling. And so one of the things we changed was to express it in that format, because that was the actual object that they had in their hands.
Interesting.
Very good. Angela?
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, actually, on that piece you were talking about, the drug chart, there actually was some research done to take a human factors approach to designing a drug chart. I think actually your co-named person on your paper, Matthew, the amazing Professor Bryony Dean Franklin, I think was involved in that research too, because actually human factors does actually take into consideration design. It's very much focused on designing to do the right thing. So, but yes, it was re-looking at and taking that sort of approach of where people are looking at and things on the chart, important pieces of information. I know, like for us in Northern Ireland, we also have a all Northern Ireland medicines chart, and we were still trying to put as much as where we can with a 1960s paper-based model to squeeze in some clinical decision support on it, and you putting all this text that you go, nobody actually is going to read that, you don't be prescribing enoxaparin and, your oral anticoagulants together, even if you've got this big banner in the front of it, because they kept missing it, but this is, but it's even interesting because I think the same argument, and I think it's actually harder for us now to do this, is when with these EPMA systems and electronic healthcare records, because they're not really designed from that user design or that user interface. And it's very hard, navigating on the information and trying to track, where to find places, and it's not very intuitive, and actually even the color aspect can be completely wrong, as well, when You think how colour impacts on our visual acuity. So it's and that's actually also just maybe we might go into this, but when you think about your guidelines, that's the whole beauty everyone thinks about with EPMA, is that, we can then incorporate, our clinical decision support into that and translate. So we have the guidelines at the point of use, but that creates a whole other arena, because now we have to get agreement on those. Because I think, Matthew, maybe one of the things you may have found, in this world is that that's the thing. They are guidelines. And a lot of people will say, well, they're guidelines, don't apply necessarily to the area I work in. We're specialist. So there's a little bit of that you have to overcome as well.
The fifth apothecary would be disappointed if we didn't come in with, they're not tramlines, they're guidelines.
Indeed.
I nearly said that.
Yeah. Go on, 2 quick things though. You're right about the EPMA system. So I remember when I was in Manchester, they were looking at this system and they said, can we have a look at the prescribing and pharmacy module part of it? And they said, yeah. And then when we looked at it in detail, it had been designed for a 50-bedded Taiwanese military hospital, which was completely different to a 1,000-bedded acute hospital. And the second thing, Angela, you might have forgotten that the amazing word is not allowed on the Aural Apothecary. However, we do make exceptions when it really is amazing or the person is amazing. And I agree with you that Bryony Dean Franklin is in that group.
Me too.
Did I make a schoolgirl error? So, name dropping. No, but it is, I think, like, even, and I guess there's the EPMA side of things. Like, we've been going through this experience in Northern Ireland because we've been rolling out Epic across all our trusts. Our third trust just went live last week. But there's a lot of, whilst we think, this is going to be great and this is the panacea, the challenge is actually sometimes it's the build program. There's only so much capacity for activity to actually get, some of the nuances of this. The system is maybe not as wonderful as previously perceived. And at the same time, you can have your protocols and things like that there, and these signposts to stuff. But then, as we know, the alert fatigue is, if you're having that from trying to avoid, drug-to-drug interactions, drug disease interactions, people just get, it's wallpaper to them, and they're just like click, 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 click. And then the other side of it is, if you do get it really good and you've got some really amazing, piece of, I suppose, decision support, there's that kind of automation bias that, well, if it does it for that drug, then I'm assuming I'm going to get it for this one. So the system's going to tell me what to do. And I think that's a lot of the research is certainly starting to show.
The Aural Apothecary is sponsored by Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching and OneLessPill.com.
Okay, I'm sure we'll come back to some of this when we actually dig into the paper. But first of all, Matthew, one of the pleasures, as you know, of coming on the Aural Apothecary is to give us 3 things. So Angela has already been on, and I'm just going to tease the listener now and say, if you haven't listened to episode 1.9, which is when Angela was on, which was all about patient safety and in particular medication safety, then please do go back. The whole episode is great. It's only 34 minutes, very positive and pacey, and she gave 3 great choices, and they were very heavily linked and very well thought out. And I will give you the names. She tried to pick 2 drugs actually, insulin and ispagula, and she picked The Doors, Break On Through. And we have already mentioned the book, which we all love, but actually that was her second choice. And her first choice book was called...
It's staring at me.
I know, I've got it here. Human Factors and Ergonomics in Practice by Stephen Sharrock and Claire Williams.
Point of accuracy, it was episode 9.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
So Angela is one of those special people that is in the original series 1. So it doesn't have a 1 in front of it because we never knew we were going to do another one, did we?
That's right. Okay, so yes, dear listener, go back and listen to episode 9. Okay, Matthew, so let's onward. What would you like to offer us as your desert island drug?
So I was tempted to say dalteparin because in my days as a hospital pharmacist, everything I did seem to end up revolving around anticoagulants and particularly dalteparin. But I'm going to go for something different. So if we go back to when I went to university to study pharmacy, I always wanted to be a hospital pharmacist. That was my plan. Then in my final year, I did a research project, and I did a pharmaceutics research project with this really enthusiastic supervisor who I really gelled with, Professor Rob Price. And so the end result is that I went and did my pre-reg, and then 18 months after that final year project, I was back in Rob's group doing a PhD in drug delivery to the lungs, which we mentioned briefly earlier. So it seems that project changed the planned direction of my career, and so it only seems appropriate that the drug we used, which is salbutamol sulfate, should be my drug of choice. We were trying to improve delivery to the lungs with a fancy new spacer device. And actually, 20 plus years later, I'm still advising PhD students on how to use it in their studies. So it seems that it's been with me on a journey, and so would be a good choice for my my desert island drug.
Do you know what? I think that's the first time. Have we had it before? Steve, you're the expert.
Yeah, so same drug, but picked for another reason, which is why we love desert island drugs, because it's about your memory, isn't it? So it was picked by Dr. Mark Porter.
Of course, clinically, we should be using much less of it, but pharmaceutically, it's very interesting.
But you're right on message there with other people who've worked in the pharmaceutical industry who clearly, picked medication that they had been involved, in its discovery and its use. So, yeah, why wouldn't you pick that? And a PhD, wow. I mean, I think Angela's doing one at the minute, but it's a massive undertaking. So fair play to you. So salbutamol, not for the first time, but a classic drug, I think, if you like, in the Aural Apothecary formulary. Okay, what about a piece of music then for the Aural Apothecary playlist?
This was hard because music is particularly performing music. I play the trumpet, and it's the big thing I do apart from pharmacy. So, I try and play most days. I've given up my practice tonight for you guys, so I hope you appreciate that.
Don't let us stop you.
Yeah, people have played their songs before.
Yeah, we could do a bonus material at the end.
I won't inflict that on anyone. And so I, as I said, I could do a whole series of stuff on music, but so it had to be trumpet music. And there's so many great trumpeters I love. It could have been Louis Armstrong or Miles Davis or Dizzy Gillespie. There's a fabulous Australian trumpeter who's still playing at the moment called James Morrison, who I was lucky enough to hear last year. So I could have picked all of those, but I've gone with something different because so when I was growing up, I started playing trumpet when I was 9, and there weren't many trumpet recordings in my house, but there was one by this American called Wynton Marsalis, playing classical music. And I loved that recording on my dad's LP. And I kind of heard that, he doesn't play classical music anymore. He's gone off and he plays this thing called jazz. And in Hereford in the 1980s, there wasn't a lot of jazz easily available. So I didn't really know about this. And then I looked it up. It was in 1993. Wynton Marsalis and his band came and they played at the BBC Proms. And I happened to watch this. And I can still remember it to this moment. These 7 musicians playing with such intensity that the sweat was pouring off them, and there was such joy and such soulfulness in what they were saying. So that was kind of the start of my love affair with jazz trumpet. And so at that prom, they were playing a sort of whole collection of pieces that lasted the whole time from an album called In This House on This Morning. And I'm going to pick one of the pieces from that, which is the most energetic and exciting piece on that album. And there's a bit of a link to pharmacy here, I think, because we all have good days and bad days at work, don't we? And probably, if we're honest, we have more bad days than good days. There's certainly in the academic world, you get knocked back more than you get sort of approved of. And this is one of the pieces that when I've had a bad day, I put on to kind of, cheer me up.
This is what we want. This is what we want to hear. Go on, sell it big.
Excellent. So that this whole piece is supposed to be a depiction of an Afro-American church service. And this is the sermon. So it's called In the Sweet Embrace of Life, the Holy Ghost. And it's just the most up-tempo, blistering piece of trumpet playing I know. So that's why I've chosen it.
Wow. Well, I look forward to listening.
I've never wanted to go and listen to a song more in the whole series.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you like it. I warned you I could give a whole series on on music. So
You did. And you did say while we were chatting before, though, that you did actually go and have a look, because it really is on Spotify, the Aural Apothecary playlist. And it is quite eclectic. There is some other jazz on there, isn't there?
there is, yes, and I noticed a lot of Bach. So good variety.
Very good. Okay, so Wynton Marsalis in The Sweet Embrace of Life, The Holy Ghost.
That's the one.
Excellent. It's in. Okay, and what about the book choice then for the Aural Apothecary Library?
So the book was tricky for different reasons. In that I read a lot of books, but not many related to pharmacy. I tend to, if I read about pharmacy, it's papers. So if you wanted a
pharmacy
desert
podcast.
island paper, I keep doing that, don't I? About medicines, I read a lot of papers about medicines, and I could give you 20 of those. My reading, I read a lot of history books, and I enjoy reading detective books, and I like to do that to get away from the rest of life. So the book I've picked is Strong Poison by Dorothy L. Sayers, and I've picked that because the detective in that story is Lord Peter Wimsey, who's a character I just find immensely fascinating and attractive. And I always enjoy going and reading those books again, or listening to the BBC sort of dramatic plays that they did on the radio based on them. They're fabulous as well. And I could have picked any of the Peter Wimsey books by Dorothy L. Sayers, but I picked this one because, well, the mystery revolves around a question of drug delivery. So it seemed appropriate to me and what I've been talking about today. So that's my recommendation.
Wow. I just quickly looked it up. It was published in 1930.
That sounds about right.
She's been cancelled, hasn't she, Dorothy L. Sayers, I think. Some of the Peter Wimsey books. I'm not sure.
They're interesting. There's certainly some problematic aspects of them, and there's some aspects
a bit like Enid Blyton.
Yeah, there's some aspects that are incredibly progressive for their time. So yeah.
What were you saying, Angela?
Just to say a bit like Agatha Christie.
Yeah, well, we mentioned that. Paul's mentioned that before, haven't you, Paul, on Final Ingredient, I think.
And I think someone picked Agatha Christie once as well, didn't they?
They did.
There was one. I had a look. Yeah.
Well, it sounds fascinating. I might have a read of that, actually. Great. Strong Poison by Dorothy L. Sayers makes it into the Aural Apothecary Library.
Shall we continue the conversation then, exploring the role of guidelines in contributing to medication errors? And so just before we went to your choices, I think Angela had a question for you, I think, Matthew. It was highly irregular that she was addressing you directly, but we'll let it go.
Before I introduce the paper, I should just say that this work was, I didn't do this work. This work was done by 6 fabulous students. One who was a MSc student at UCL, and then 5 of our pharmacy students in Bath who worked really hard on this. So all the credit should go to them. Xiaozhen, Freya, Asma, Felicity, Nicholas, Emily were those students. And then also we mentioned the amazing Brian Dean Franklin. I think officially that was allowed earlier, wasn't it? She was a big help with this, and also her colleagues in London, Sarah Garfield. So yes, what we did in this, we wanted to look at these guideline errors and look at them in detail and work out where do they happen, who do they happen to, which guidelines, etc. And the way we did that was we used the incident reports that have been submitted to the National Reporting and Learning System in England and Wales. So that's sort of a summation of all the incident reports in the NHS. And we used 6 years of data from there. The NRLS team ran a search of their reports for us, looking for the names of common guidelines. So we were looking for words like guideline and BNF and British National Formulary, etc. And they sent those reports over to us. We had about 28,000 of those. And then those poor 6 students slogged through about 5,700 of these, reading the descriptions of these errors and then coding if there was sort of positive evidence in there that some kind of problem, either finding or understanding a guideline, contributed to that medication incident happening. So they worked really hard on this. So that's what we did. What we found, we identified, once you kind of scale up the sample we looked at to the whole 28,000 guidelines, we found that maybe there'd be about 3,200 problems with guidelines that contributed to an incident. And there were many more where the detail just wasn't enough to decide. About half the time, the problem was finding the guideline rather than understanding it. And then the most frequently involved guidelines were those what we called local guidelines, things that are written in a particular hospital or area to say how we treat asthma around here or whatever it might be. So it helps to sort of focus in on where the problems happen and what to do about it.
Those are written with good intentions, those ones you're just referring to then at the end, aren't they, Matthew?
Yeah, well, they're all written with good intentions, but it goes back to the, I think very often these local guidelines, we've probably all been there, that people have to write them and fit them in around their patient-facing work, and it's often the end of the day or in their own time that they're doing it. So there's a bit of a rush to get it done, and we're health professionals, not designers. So, as we were saying earlier, we maybe need to draw in some extra expertise in this area.
What I was really curious about, because I've reviewed a lot of incident reports over my time, and one thing that really grates on me actually is when you find the incident and say, well, what's the causative factors, or people are alluding to what that is, and they'll just say person didn't follow the guidelines, and I'll be quite curious to know, was that sort of the level of detail you get? Because what you don't get in incident reports is the why. We're never very good at trying to understand what was actually going on at the time for the people to make the decisions that they did, because actually people don't go out set out to do a bad job. We're dealing in complex adaptive systems, and things are changing all the time in the environment that they're working in and what they find themselves at that day. So it's this whole counterfactual reasoning that the person filling out the incident report just goes, they didn't follow the guideline, and then the next heart sink for me is they're basically put on a retraining, a reflective program of that sort of blame, shame, and retrain. So I was just curious, because that's what I would have experienced in any incident analysis I would do, is that sort of didn't follow the guideline, didn't follow the procedure. And then also sort of a question, can I ask another question? Just a little segue.
Can't stop her.
I suppose my thing is, do you think we make things far too prescriptive, so that therefore basically we're trying to make everything very in a reductionist method, very linear, and you go, if so therefore because if we write the guidelines in that way, we're making people fail, because they're not going to be able to do that, because our systems are too complex and adaptive.
So to answer your first question then, we found that situation a lot where I mentioned earlier that in lots of reports we couldn't really see, there wasn't enough detail to know what had gone wrong, and that was about half the reports. Basically it was clear the guideline hadn't been followed, but we didn't know why. So absolutely matches your experience. Of the 5,700 that the students looked at, I think it was only about 600 where they could actually positively identify a problem with guideline use being a contributing factor. And then there were another 2,500 where the guideline hadn't been followed, but we don't know why. So absolutely matching your experience there. In terms of should we make guidelines more prescriptive? I think it depends on the situation and what your guideline's about.
Or less prescriptive.
Sorry, yes, less prescriptive. Well, I think in some situations, certainly in some of my user testing work, what we've found is you need to make them more prescriptive. So, for example, in the work looking at injectable medicines administration, you sometimes get things like dilute it in between 100 and 500 mils of normal saline or something like that. And then what the nurses would say to me is, well, is it 100 or 500? How do I know? You're not giving me the information I need to make that decision. So, and then you look into it and you could just give one volume to everyone. And you probably pick the minimum volume because you're worried about your fluid restricted patients or whatever. So I think it depends on the situation, where if you need to give choice and flexibility because that's what clinically is needed, and patients are all different and that we very often need that, then obviously we have to do that, but we have to give people some steers as to how to make those decisions. And if actually you can be prescriptive, it's really helpful just to say, just do this, and to take away that decision making.
Yeah, that ambiguity.
Yeah, quite often guidelines are vague because the experts writing them don't like to commit And so they devolve the responsibility for that decision making to the less experienced people who are using the guidelines. And I think it probably needs to be the other way around.
Because I always keep thinking about, because we get this, writing even like a safety messaging or lots of things that we do, but we've now got, so our target audience is the junior doctors, because junior doctors do 70% of the prescribing, and you think what they're now, the whole digital world that they're in, it's TikTok and Instagram, and it's fast, it's instantaneous, it's punchy, and it's to the point. The way they are, they don't read reams and reams of information. They're not going to go hunting for the line that they need to find that gives them the answer, and we have to really revolutionize how we do this in the future. But also, as I was saying earlier, the whole digital, our whole digital landscape with our whole electronic prescribing, that's where they're going to expect that information to be. They're not going to click on to somewhere else. So, there needs to be a bit more sort of smarter design. And actually, that's bringing back in the human factors. We need to actually do that sort of, these software companies need to start designing from the outset with the user at the heart of, the system, and because it's them that need to be able to access the information and navigate through it. So and then equally we have people who move around trust to trusts and organizations and everywhere, and then we have different guidelines, and and that makes it incredibly confusing as well for the staff.
So one of the things I threatened in the WhatsApp group before tonight, I was going to bring in Ralph Stacey's complexity matrix, and I'm going to do it. I think sometimes we introduce guidelines, don't we, as a solution to a problem. Often, it's the wrong antibiotics being prescribed or the wrong drugs being prescribed, and when you look at what this when you look at complexity, you sort of he divides, Ralph Stacey in this grid divides systems into a simple system, a complicated system, a complex system, and a chaotic system. And what he's saying is that guidelines only really work when you're in a simple system. Yet we operate in a complex system, often chaotic system. And so actually, the science is telling us that guidelines don't work in the very environment that we're putting them in. So I think that's backing up, what you've both said. It's backing up the evidence of your research. But I think it's what you're saying, Angela, is we need to not... If we're just introducing guidelines as a solution on its own, it's never going to work. And we've got to start thinking differently about how we support decision making in practice.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to kind of system resilience. It's like, as I said, there's a buffering. Things are, people will make their workarounds. They'll have interpreted that piece of information, Matthew, you were describing earlier. They'll have to make a decision. There's a patient at the end of the day waiting for that medicine to be administered. There can also be situations whereby the senior staff go, well, that's not how we do this here, and so they're not. There's that sort of what's the culture like in that environment, and receptiveness to even challenge the junior doctors. I remember doing a case-based discussion with the junior doctor, and they were asking me, it was around insulin prescribing, and they went, well, this is what I thought that needed to happen, but the nurse who had 20 years qualified over me said, no, that's not what we do around here. So, that's where there's all of this kind of very adaptive behaviours and situations that go on, and we have to kind of sort of accept that. Because actually, in most of the times, as I said earlier, things actually do go safe. So, I think drilling in, on your paper, what I'd really love to know is what are those incidents, that cause that moderate to severe harm and death. And what did that look like? But that's where we can't just look at reports. There needs to be that more investigative, thematic sort of reviews as well.
Absolutely.
That bit about whether or not guidance, one, should exist and how prescriptive they should be. So if you think of some of the guests we've had on here, so Professor James McCormack from Canada, who talks a lot, and Jamie and I are on the Royal College of GPs overdiagnosis group, and there's lots of chat, isn't there, Jamie, about guidelines, and the John Lorna piece that Jamie mentioned in the last episode about the fact that yes, we're dealing with complex things, and therefore a guideline actually sometimes is one. And like Jonathan Underhill, when he was on, obviously guidelines, not tram lines. That point about you need to know, don't you, with experience, when to use the guideline or when not to use the guideline, and therefore that bit about how prescriptive should they be is the interesting bit. But I think why I like this paper so much, and it's fascinating to hear that you used students, because it's a really good model, isn't it? So, you've got your professor at the top, and then you've got other postdocs, and then you've got other people doing the work. But actually, this is a piece of work that when I first saw it, I was like, I love this piece of work. I've never seen anything like this before. And so, yes, there are difficulties in you getting behind the why, as Angela said, as to why something happened. So even if you look at when you put them in tables of, the examples where somebody died, for example, where the elderly patient was given the dose for tobramycin, the antibiotic with a narrow therapeutic index of 10 milligrams per kilo per day instead of 3 milligrams per kilo, which instead they used the cystic fibrosis dose. And it says, guideline was inappropriately used, but we don't know anything, do we, about who was involved and whether they understood the difference or whether they actually read it. So, of course there are some limitations in it, but I think it's a great piece of work in relation to the whole chat about the guideline is not the tram line, and that if you work in health, it's not cans of beans we're dealing with people and their complexity, and therefore that's why guidelines are not the be all and end all, in which they appear to have become in lots of cases.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, that tobramycin case, I remember when I first read the text for that, and almost my blood ran cold, because you could just sort of go, it was one of those there but for the grace of God go I moments, because you could just see how that happened and how not just the guideline.
It happen.
Yeah, so many things contributed to that, and you could just obviously feel for the patient and the family involved, but for the staff involved as well. It must have been horrendous.
Jay, what did you think?
Well, no, I was going to take you onto a different place, but it's you that I need for this. Is remember the slides that you shared with me?
Many, often.
The lady going into a clinical trial, and then the old gentleman with lots of comorbidity. Yeah. So explain how you use those slides, because that links to guidelines, doesn't it? Because that's the contribution to the evidence base.
I had these two great slides when I used to do teaching, mainly to junior doctors actually, about prescribing and others. And I had two pictures and I would show them. And one picture was a beautiful sort of farmer type picture with all the people in the picture were beautiful, okay? The patient was beautiful, the nurse around was beautiful, the doctor was a man, he was very handsome, and it was all sort of like photoshopped, and it all looked beautiful. And then the alternative was a very old, frail man sat on his bed with a nasal prongs on. He had a drip in his hand. He looked unwell. He was holding an orange, if I remember rightly, Jamie. And I used to flash...
Trying to eat it with a spoon.
Yeah, trying to eat it with a spoon, that's it. And I used to flash between the two slides, and I'd go, clinical trial patient, real patient, clinical trial patient, real patient. And I suppose that's what you're trying to say. Is that what you're asking me, James?
Well, yeah. And so I have taken it and use it now. And I ask, what happens when this patient rocks up to a clinical trial? Well, the gentleman with all the comorbidities and the decline in renal function is excluded. And the first patient comes in with a healthy user effect. And then our guidelines, this is where I'm getting to, our guidelines then, the patient on the receiving end of those guidelines, our protocol-driven, guideline-driven view of the world, is the older gentleman with several comorbidities. He's on 15 items already. His renal function's in his boots. And yet, actually, the evidence base hasn't been developed for him at all, or with him in mind at all. So it's a bit flippant, maybe, but I use it as a teaching aid now as well.
Go on, Angela. You had another question.
I think sometimes it's basically who are we writing the guidelines for, and is it for the organisation, or is it for the person at the cold face? Because a lot of the time, I would sort of say sometimes those policies are written for the organisation. Assurance. It's to basically go, we have the guideline, we're covered, in case like obviously you guys at CQC, we've got different bodies here, but that's the thing. It's what's the purpose of it? Because actually, is it going to actually even be accessed and used, or what happens is it is then used and brought out when somebody has made an error? So there's a lot of time, and sorry, just a lot of time. It's one of the things you said is that Matthew, in your paper, a lot of people don't even know where to find the information. it's so hidden on trust internet sites. The names of them are also equally very poor of how they're being named when they're put onto the system. So that even needs quite a lot of good thinking about that.
That was
Years
the
ago,
biggest
actually,
group, wasn't it, that you
it was
found?
to find it, and actually,
Finding the guideline was the
yeah,
biggest root cause.
yeah, a piece of work I did way back in Salford, like Stephen was like actually got I used to get the junior doctors in sort of induction training, was actually get them into a computer room and then give them questions about medicines to see and to help them to basically navigate where they could find the information on the trust intranet site, because that's what they needed. They needed to have that opportunity of just sitting to be able to kind of work through just kind of some queries and then find out where they would go. But we, that's the thing. We don't do that. And now actually, most of the time, certainly in my experiences now is that they go to the apps. They're looking for the information on EOLIF's, I think, app is what we were using here. But they wanted something much more quicker and accessible.
Well, a well-designed app that has all the approved guidelines on it in an easily searchable format could well be a useful solution in this area. Just needs to be done properly, doesn't it? And I've seen a few little interesting studies hinting that might be possible. So let's hope we can make that work properly.
The bottom line here then, isn't it, and we've said this right from the start when we started about still not safe, is this your basic conclusion from this really, good study, caveats yes, but large number of incidents. But really what you're saying is that actually the issue is that you need to think about the information. And what you found was that where it was local guideline, and you have to question, why do you need a local guideline if there's a national guideline? So local guidelines seem particularly bad. And also guidelines really probably need user testing. And then, as you said in some of your previous research, user testing has proven that you're likely to get less errors in the real world if you actually user test the guideline. That's essentially what this paper's saying, isn't it?
Yeah, I would probably caveat the thing around local guidelines being particularly bad. I think they're particularly highly used, so you might expect them to feature more often. But that's certainly where we found the most reports of problems, and that's probably the thing that's most easily actionable by pharmacists and other professionals across the country. And yes, the way to do that, get the users involved. Formal user testing would be fantastic, and I'm thinking about that a lot and how that might be done, but even something less formal would be helpful. I've recently finished a series of interviews with guideline authors around the country about the process, and they all said, "Oh no, we don't really get the users involved. We have to consult with all the senior stakeholders to get it all signed off. But no, we really should show we should show the users." And it's obvious when you think about it, but for some reason we don't do it. They were really interesting interviews as well, because we talked about, who are we doing this for? And they talked a bit about that. And they talked about how actually it almost becomes a game in itself, because they're constantly on the treadmill of getting the guideline updated before the deadline, because the compliance team will be on their case if they don't, and there's not time able to do this properly. The whole thing needs a look
so
at.
You just rename it then as a template, don't you? You say, no, this isn't a guideline, nothing to see here. It's just a template.
Yeah.
Well, if there's a national one, use it. I mean, don't create any work and put anyone at risk if you don't need it. I mean, we have a British national formulary.
But it's even not user tested. I think it goes back to that point. It's actually, it's co-design. Why don't we actually ask? Why don't we actually try to give time to junior doctors to go, would you like to actually write this for yourself and your peers? So that's really about that participative and iterative type design that we need. And it's really interesting because I think you mentioned this as well earlier, it was about health literacy. So we're in this world of trying to design things for our patients much better, but are we actually doing the same thing for our staff? In terms of, and health literacy isn't just about being able to read something, it's about understanding. And we need to actually bring those principles back to us as healthcare professionals. I think we assume too much, that people actually will be able to quickly, we're all very highly educated. We should be able to assimilate this information and read it, and understand exactly what to do. But number one, maybe not. And secondly, also, that's okay. Maybe if you're sitting in a nice quiet place having a cup of coffee and not dealing with 101 other things and that are happening all at the same time. And I think there's also something, isn't it? Like junior doctors are meant to, on their first day, like in their workplace, have like 300 odd guidelines. Something ridiculous. Like when they first start out, it's like. And you only ever retain 7 pieces of information in your working memory. So, it's what are we trying to ask?
Very good. Thank you. A big thank you to Matthew and Angela for joining us on the Aural Apothecary. For Matthew for sharing his Desert Island Drug, his career anthem, and his book for the Aural Apothecary Library. Coming up next time, we'll be joined by
Emily Reeve.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. You can contact us via Twitter at Aural Apothecary. We're on LinkedIn. You can email us at auralapothecarypod@gmail.com. The website, theauralapothecary.com. Gimmo now with a final ingredient.
Okay, so thanks both. That was great, as expected. Really nice to meet you for the first time, Matthew, and nice to see you again, Angela. I think actually you are the first guest who's come back on a normal episode. We've had a few back for Christmas specials and as guest presenters, but I think Steve, you're the expert. But Angela's the first guest to come back, isn't it? Yeah,
I think that's true. If you take out Claire Howard, the fourth apothecary, who's featured quite a lot. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. So it's great to see you again, and look forward to hearing more about your role sometime, as well as what was it, medication safety lead for Northern Ireland. So for this week's final ingredient, actually returned to another guest who we talked to, and that was Ravi Sharma when we talked about pharmacogenomics. And in fact, that was episode 8, which was the episode before you, Angela. So much like artificial intelligence, pharmacogenomics has been touted as the next big thing. Unlike AI, it doesn't seem to have grown much in the popular imagination or made as much progress. So my eye was caught this week by 2 headlines in the Pharmaceutical Journal. The first one was 1/4 of patients in pharmacogenomics trial have had prescriptions changed after receiving their genetic testing results. So this story was actually based on a presentation at the Royal Pharmaceutical Conference last week. So I don't know if you saw it, by Jessica Keane. And she was talking about a program exploring the feasibility of rolling out pharmacogenomics testing for patients taking statins, antidepressants and proton pump inhibitors, where clinicians viewed patients' results and decided whether a drug was suitable for a patient depending on its pharmacogenetic profile. If it was green, it was still appropriate, or if it was red, they all based on their metabolism, they altered the drug, and the software pointed out the alternative ones that they could try. This is really what we thought pharmacogenomics would be doing by now, isn't it? And so this research is encouraging, perhaps a place in the real world for pharmacogenomics. But sadly, the second headline in the PJ suggests not. NHS Scotland scraps pharmacogenomic decision support service. So this was a service and supposed £66 million investment that was a programme designed to offer prescribers, similar to above, a clinically actionable pharmacogenomics information programme. But for unknown reasons, the plug seems to have been pulled. So that's the final ingredient, really, and there you have it. Is on the one hand, evidence is beginning to emerge on just how effective genetic testing can be, and it could be a game changer. But on the other hand, no one seems prepared to pay for it.
You have been listening to a 3 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough, original music Jamie Brewster, artwork by David Baker and Jacob Howard.
Thanks for listening to the Aural Apothecary podcast. Warning: harmless if digested.
This episode of the Aural Apothecary is sponsored by jamiehayes.co.uk.